even agree on the terms exactly, and she was not satisfied with allowing Hunter Biden pleading guilty, accepting a plea deal that might expose him to future criminal investigation or otherwise. It's amazing that they didn't dot all their I's and cross all their T's before they walked into this courthouse. They clearly wrote a plea agreement that they thought would satisfy both sides with a little bit of ambiguity in there, and the judge put her finger on that ambiguity and the thing fell apart.
Before I go to Olivia on color from inside the courtroom, one other note, Terry, just to cut through the noise on all this today. This first appeared to begin to fall apart when the judge began asking questions about whether or not Hunter Biden believed that this would give him immunity going forward to other charges that could be coming. She asked the Justice Department if there was an investigation still underway. The answer in court was yes. When Hunter Biden's attorneys heard that, they then said, well, wait a minute, no deal, in so many words. So the judge bringing up this notion that do you believe, Hunter Biden, that there will be immunity going forward on any other potential charges that could be coming your way? The fact that there was confusion on that, she said, well, wait a minute here. We should look at this very closely.
That's it exactly, David. And this has been a problem since they announced the deal to begin with. You may remember that Hunter Biden's attorney came out and said, as far as we are concerned, this deal ends the investigation. And the U.S. Attorney for Delaware, David Weiss, issued a statement saying the investigation's ongoing. That conflict was in the middle of this deal from the beginning, and the judge merely put her finger on it in questioning Hunter Biden himself. One of her jobs in presiding over a plea agreement is to make sure the defendant knows exactly what he or she is pleading to, so that it can't be appealed later, so that there's no confusion. And that's when she started tugging at it, and it came apart.
And so, Olivia, take us into the courtroom for that moment when it appeared to really begin to unravel, when she looked to Hunter Biden and his attorneys and said, do you understand this, that there could be an ongoing investigation here, and that what you have agreed to here today does not necessarily make you immune to perhaps other charges? Again, these are all hypotheticals, but the judge's responsibility is to present this to everybody in the courtroom. That was the moment when you first saw a real challenge to this?
It was the first moment, David, as you just laid out, but it certainly was not the last. And I think if there was one thing to sort of take away how this unfolded inside of that courtroom was the amount of times that the Department of Justice and Hunter Biden's team attempted to come together on this to convince the judge that they had put together a good deal, that they were both on the same side. Should anything go wrong down the road, that they would be on the same side of this. And that was never enough for the judge, and there were multiple times where she pushed back on them. She went through every single page of that deal with a fine-tooth comb, asking both sides questions. They broke for recess at multiple points so they could try to kind of come together on that. It was almost as if it was an in-the-moment live negotiation underway inside of that courtroom as they tried to fit this together into something that all sides could agree to. In that moment that you noted, when the prosecutor essentially stood up and said there is no deal here, that came when they could not agree on exactly what he was being covered by. But even when they came back after recess, they had been able to come together and say they would protect him on certain issues for certain years. Still, David, the judge continued piecing through that agreement and finding more issues, at one point questioning at all if the agreement was even constitutional and if her involvement in it would bring up issues down the road. So really a roller coaster of an hours-long hearing where they kept trying to come together, ultimately, as you said, deferring on the agreement, so no ruling on if she will accept it. And in the meantime, Hunter having to plead not guilty, David.
In the meantime, Olivia, a quick follow-up to you, because I think you're hitting on a point that's extremely important here, that when there is a significant concern on the part of the judge, it's fairly rare from the stories we've covered in the past that both sides would be able to come to an agreement very quickly or within hours before the day's end. And it appeared that after that short recess, Hunter Biden's attorneys and federal prosecutors, of course, David Weiss, the U.S. attorney in this case, prosecuting the case. He was a Trump-appointed attorney. President Biden, the Justice Department, did not change that. They allowed him to continue prosecuting. That, as you pointed out, Olivia, the two sides, Biden's attorneys and the federal prosecutors in this case, seemed determined for quite some time to still make this deal in some shape or form happen here.
They were absolutely determined, David, and you could see that every single time that they would come back from those recesses, they would say, "We have spoken, we are on the same page." At one point, Hunter's own attorney looking at the judge and just saying, quite frankly, how eager they were to put this behind them. It had been 5 years. They had come to the point. They had spent hours and hours meeting and going over the the president's son's taxes line by line and saying, these are the charges that we think have amounted from hours and years of meetings. But still, as we kind of discussed earlier, the judge really taking issue with sort of the legal nuances of how this deal was structured. And I do just want to take one point here to lay out one of her chief concerns, which is what happens if Hunter Biden violates this deal that he's signing? What do you do then? According to the deal that they had put together, they would have to come back to the judge and present the evidence for her to find a determination if he had violated, if more charges should be brought. And she said, that's not a position that I'm supposed to be in, and that gives me concerns if this is constitutional at all. And again, David, you had the Department of Justice and Hunter's team coming together saying, no, 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 this is why we can do this, but still not enough for her today.
Really fascinating. Olivia, one more question to you, because in addition to that concern that if he violated the agreement, it would have to come back to her. Earlier in the day, her other main sticking point, it seemed from your reporting, Olivia, and correct me if I'm wrong, her main sticking point was not this decision on Hunter Biden's part to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor tax charges. She had more of a question about this pretrial diversion program, which would have allowed him to avoid prosecution on that separate felony gun charge, because she thought it was, from your reporting, essentially too sweeping in nature by what it also included in the writing.
That's exactly right. She laid out that she felt that that agreement underlining what he would not be prosecuted for was too broad. She was asking the Department of Justice, quite frankly, in a line of questioning that got quite heated at one point, if they had any precedent for this, if they had anything that they could show her, in what world, a diversion agreement on a certain crime would include language about other potential crimes. And that eventually developed, David, into a conversation where she asked the Department of Justice point blank, is this an ongoing investigation, with the Department of Justice telling her that it was, in fact. And like you said, like we discussed before, that was a sticking point where they had to take another recess. So still clearly here, the potential for more charges, as the Department of Justice laid out, and the judge really digging into that to say, I don't want this deal to prevent anything that could come in the future. Yeah,
that got our attention as reporters, certainly got the attention of Hunter Biden as an attorneys and his attorneys at that table when they said there is ongoing investigation of Hunter Biden. Terry, Olivia, stand by with us. I want to bring in our legal team. Dan Abrams, let's start with you. What do you make of what transpired here today?
So I think you have to separate this out into 2 major issues, right, that came up. Both were problems. First was, what is the scope of the immunity? Meaning, when you enter into a plea agreement, the prosecutors are agreeing not to prosecute you anymore for these particular crimes. But the question became, well, which crimes and what time period? It seems they were able to resolve that issue, right? They were able to narrow it down to 2014 to 2019. They were able to focus on the particular charges at issue here, which would mean that he could be prosecuted potentially for something else. That was issue 1. Issue 2 was, as Olivia is talking about, the relationship between the guilty plea to the tax crimes and the non-prosecution agreement on the gun charge. And here's why that's important. Because when it comes to the tax crimes, you're talking about crimes, pleading guilty to crimes. And the judge, in a pretty straightforward way, can either accept that plea or not. It's the non-prosecution agreement that makes it more complicated. Because on that separate gun charge, what the prosecutors are trying to do is say, he's not pleading guilty to anything. We're just agreeing not to prosecute him as long as he adheres to certain requirements. Well, this is where it got tricky, because the judge is saying, well, wait a second, who's going to be deciding if he violates the terms of that agreement? I would guess that has to come back to me, right? So this non-prosecution agreement isn't just an agreement that you're making with Hunter Biden. I actually have to be a part of it. It kind of seems like you're linking in the tax crimes in conjunction with this non-prosecution agreement. And as a result, the judge, in effect, saying, this is a bit of a mess. This is too much of a mess for me to accept it right now. So expect that the next step in this is going to be that the two parties, remember, the defense and the prosecution are effectively on the same side here. They want to resolve this. They want to move forward with this plea deal. And so I would expect that this is something that they could resolve. I would expect that they will come back to court with different language, particularly on the non-prosecution agreement, because it seems that that remains the legal sticking point.
Very well explained, Dan, and it appears that we are all on the same page, even despite the breaking nature of these developments. Stick with us, Dan, because what Dan just also said is very important here. This is a plea deal on hold right now. It did not go through today, does not mean it won't go through in the coming days, but this judge in the case said it's far too confusing and not clear enough. The two sides have to get back to work on this before coming back to me and provide additional clarification. Dan, for those of us who do not have law degrees here, help us and the viewers at home understand why then at the very end of this meeting in court today, he pleaded not guilty then.
Well, because the only way he's going to plead guilty is if there's a plea agreement, right? So he's now in court for a proceeding in connection with this case, and there's no option other than to plead not guilty. That is basically just saying, we're putting this on hold for now, but it doesn't mean anything significant. Don't read too much into it. All it means is there's a temporary pause on this matter. It sounds like for 14 days. But again, because the prosecution and defense are effectively, aligned here, I've got to believe that they can come up with language. Now, remember, this does leave open the possibility that Hunter Biden could get prosecuted for something else down the road. But it is clear that his lawyers believe that after a 5-year investigation, that they have everything, that there's nothing new that's going to come up. Now, others may disagree with that, but his lawyers clearly believe that, because if they didn't, they would be very concerned about a prosecutor saying, and yes, there's still an investigation that is ongoing here, but that would be into other matters, right? Can't prosecute for the same crimes, the same basic events where someone has pled guilty.
And that they seem to come to an agreement to, even again after that recess, when they narrowed it down to a certain number of years and his taxes, they came back to the room and said, okay, we have agreed to this window of time. Then the judge had other concerns in addition to the ones that you point out right now. But again, for folks at home saying, well, wait a minute, we thought he was going to go in there and plead not guilty, plead guilty to misdemeanor charges. Instead, he pleaded not guilty. That's essentially a placeholder, Dan, until they can, both sides
Correct.
can work on this for another couple of weeks. Asha Rangappa, I want to bring in professor at Yale Law School, also former special agent, New York Division of the FBI. Asha, you've been watching this right along with us and along with Dan as well. And for this federal judge, and we know this entire country's watching this case, and you don't need me to tell you how politicized and polarized this country is right now. For a judge who likely did not want to be at the center of this case, she suddenly finds herself exactly in that place in this case because she didn't like the terms of this agreement.
Yes, we have to remember that when a judge is looking at a plea agreement, her job is to make sure that the defendant fully understands what he or she is doing. In pleading guilty, a defendant is waiving a number of rights. They're waiving their right to a trial by jury, waiving a right to confront the witnesses against them. And so the defendant has to give informed consent. So she's looking out for the defendant here and saying, is it clear to the defendant exactly what he is giving up in agreeing to the government's terms? And what she found was that the way that this agreement was written had really muddied the waters, and there wasn't a meeting of the minds. And this is why she had a problem with it. Now, as Dan also mentioned, there's an aspect of this, the diversionary program, which is not a plea deal. This is a prosecutorial discretion, an alternative to prosecution, saying we won't charge you at all if you meet these conditions. And so she's saying, if you're inserting me into this to determine whether or not he meets these conditions, you're basically putting the judicial branch in the role of deciding whether or not to prosecute. And that is a separation of powers issue. So there were two big issues going on, as Dan mentioned, the ambiguity, the muddying of the waters in terms of what he was agreeing to, and also this blurring of the lines between the executive branch and the role of the judiciary in this type of agreement.
All right, Asha Rangappa with us as well. Asha, thanks to you and to Dan. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, because, John, the key issue in this case was immunity. We know that Hunter Biden's attorneys were willing to allow their client to plead guilty to these 2 misdemeanor tax charges, knowing that in doing so, it would protect him from other charges perhaps moving forward. And that's where it became quite confusing today.
Yeah, the way the Hunter Biden legal team looked at this case is Hunter Biden has been under investigation for 5 years. The grand jury has seen evidence related to his foreign business dealings, to many of the things that Republicans have been bringing up in their oversight hearings in the House. His dealings with Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company, his dealings with a large Chinese energy company, that they've looked at all of this and that the only thing they came up with was the tax charges. And the way the Biden team looked at the tax charges are that these are charges that would normally not be prosecuted in their view. He didn't pay his taxes in 2017. He didn't pay them in 2018, but he did eventually repay all of the taxes, including penalties and interest. So he's good with the IRS. He's paid what he was owed. So in their view, you wouldn't normally face criminal charges for that. You would pay the fines, you would pay the interest, and you'd be done with it. So the only reason he was willing to plead guilty to those 2 misdemeanors was that he would have immunity from charges against everything else that came before the grand jury over these past 5 years. This was all about the immunity. The only reason he was willing to plead guilty to tax charges, 2 misdemeanors, was because he would get immunity. And as you saw, when it came before the court, his view of what kind of immunity he would have and the DOJ's view of what kind of immunity he would have were at odds.
And what's unclear is whether or not the DOJ, whether federal prosecutors were saying sort of in a hypothetical fashion, or whether there is a legitimate investigation ongoing, and if there are potentially further charges. Obviously, they did not reveal that in court, but just the mere mention of it had the Hunter Biden legal team saying, well, wait a minute here, and that really had the judge concerned.
They were adamant, David. I can tell you from my conversations with them, they were adamant that this investigation would now be over, that Hunter Biden had it put behind him. No more investigation, no more charges. Whatever the Republicans want to talk about on the Hill and bring up allegations, they wanted to be able to turn to this and say, it's been looked into. A Trump-appointed prosecutor looked at it for 5 years. A grand jury heard evidence. And all they came up with were these 2 misdemeanor charges. And that is the only thing that he is guilty of. So, look, this was not a minor thing. This was everything. Immunity was everything from the Hunter Biden perspective. If there is no immunity, there is no deal.
John Karl, stick with us. Pierre Thomas also sitting with us as we watch this play out today. Pierre, obviously Chief Justice correspondent, covers the Attorney General and the Justice Department, and has for many years. David Weiss, the U.S. attorney in this case, was appointed by former President Trump. The Biden Justice Department did nothing to end that. They said he should continue to investigate Hunter Biden. They wanted a hands-off approach and wanted to send a message that they were allowing him to continue. He put this plea deal forward, and he has pushed back against Republican criticism that there has been any sort of influence from the Biden White House or the Biden Justice Department in his investigation. He was comfortable with what he walked into that courtroom today, the federal U.S. attorney, the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor. So he also has to go back here in these interim weeks back to the drawing board and try to make this judge happy.
Correct, David. And here's the thing. This is not unprecedented because sometimes these deals do get messy. But judges don't like messy. They like deals where they can look at the law look at the deal and see if everything is simpatico. The judge clearly from the outset was not comfortable with that today. And therefore, they have now a number of weeks to try to resolve this. Dave Weiss and suffice to say, Hunter Biden's attorneys will have to really focus on, can they come up with language that will resolve the judge's concerns? And David, at the end of the day, the word privilege keeps coming up in this case. Biden's critics would say that because he was the president's son and the son of a vice president, he got access to these kind of lucrative deals, that he was able to make millions of dollars, make these kinds of mistakes. They're also saying because he's the president's son, he got a sweetheart deal. On the other hand, people would say because he has Joe Biden's last name is the reason that he was prosecuted as zealously as he's been prosecuted. Typically, these are not the type of cases, tax cases, that a federal prosecutor goes into court when someone's already repaid the money. Doesn't happen. The gun charge is not typically one that a federal prosecutor would bring regarding a single false statement without an aggravating gun charge. So this ongoing debate about Hunter Biden is all about privilege, and you're seeing it play out on Capitol Hill, and you're seeing it play out, in the public writ large. But at the end of the day, this is going to be something that taints this case going forward.
And the point you're making is they're arguing that same argument from both sides when it comes to this term privilege, that he wouldn't have had the scrutiny that he has unless he was the president's son, but he wouldn't have had the access that he had unless he was the president's son. So that's going to continue, certainly in this polarized nation. I want to bring in Rachel Scott. She's live at the White House. Rachel, this White House in recent days has said the president was not in any kind of business dealings with his son. And has there been a reaction this afternoon to the news?
David, the White House press secretary reacting to this news just moments ago, saying that Hunter Biden is a private citizen, going on to say that the president and the first lady continue to love and support their son Hunter as he continues to rebuild his life. The White House has really tried to keep a firm distance away from all of this, repeatedly refusing to answer further questions when pressed by reporters. But the press secretary today did make one thing very clear. She emphasized that this is an independent investigation by the Justice Department and went on to say that it's being led by a prosecutor that was appointed by former President Donald Trump. David.
Rachel Scott at the White House for us. Rachel with late word and their reaction coming in from the White House press secretary. Thank you, Rachel. Again, you're watching breaking coverage at this hour. Hunter Biden, obviously President Biden's son, who had, it was believed he would go into federal court in Delaware today and plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor charges, tax charges. But that did not happen when the judge expressed concerns over the plea deal, the structure of the plea deal that had been presented her, even though both sides had agreed to it. Hunter Biden's legal team and the federal prosecutors with the U.S. Justice Department, the lead U.S. attorney on that case, had actually been appointed by former President Trump. And the Biden Justice Department made it very clear that they weren't going to change that. They were going to allow him to continue to investigate and prosecute this case. I want to bring in Terry Moran. Terry, the judge said one more thing, and I want to just make sure we're on record with this before we go off the air. The judge said Hunter Biden obviously entering this not guilty plea in the interim. She said, I want another briefing from both parties in the coming weeks. I'm not going to say I'm going to accept the agreement. I'm not going to say I'll deny it either.
And that, David, is because of the ambiguity that she uncovered in her questioning of Hunter Biden and of the lawyers. These parties, Hunter Biden and his lawyers and the prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Delaware, came to this court thinking they were going to wrap it up today, wrap it up in a nice little package with a bow on it. They had written a plea agreement creatively, even maybe a little too cute in some ways, allowing some ambiguity in there that both sides could talk about. Hunter Biden could say, I've put my troubles behind me. The prosecutors could say, we're still looking at this. She didn't like any of that. She's thrown it out. And what she's now done is pour gasoline on the fire of Hunter Biden's legal problems, certainly in our politics. And they're going to have to clean up what is a pretty significant legal mess that she has uncovered, didn't like. Have to go back to the drawing board.
And Terry Moran, I see you referencing Olivia Rubin standing next to you. Olivia, I'll give you the last word. It was clear that today, even though Hunter Biden was front and center, now the nation knows the judge in this case, Mary Ellen Noriega, who was not happy with the ambiguity of this plea deal. Again, even though the plea deal was reached after a 5-year investigation between Hunter Biden's legal team and by the U.S. Justice Department. And again, can't make the point enough that it's a U.S. attorney who was appointed under former President Trump, who has pushed back against claims of influence on his investigation. Regardless of all of that, the judge said the plea deal that was presented to me in this courtroom today is too ambiguous. I'm not comfortable with it, in so many words.
That's exactly right. And I'll give you her exact words as she sort of wrapped up this hearing. Her summary of the plea deal, though she tried to say she was not criticizing it, she said it was atypical, it was not straightforward, and for that reason, it would not go forward today. And again, I just can't emphasize enough that that was after hours of questions to both the Department of Justice, to Hunter's legal team, to Hunter himself about his life, about his sobriety, about his business dealings, for hours questioning, trying to get to the bottom of what had happened here in this deal, ultimately not happy with it, potentially back in a couple weeks. David.
Olivia Rubin, Terry Moran, our thanks to you both in Delaware. And again, Olivia just reporting Judge Noriega saying this is atypical. And when you're a judge presiding over a case that involves the president's son, you want to make sure that you're comfortable with everything in the plea deal that you are presiding over. No question about that. She clearly was not. Both teams have been given, at least in the early reporting, 14 days here to make this less ambiguous, if you will, to try to come to terms on the language to see if that'll appease this judge. She has indicated to them that it doesn't necessarily mean I will accept it in 14 days, but also made the point that I won't deny it either. And as Olivia just mentioned there, she said she went out of her way to say, I'm not saying that this is an agreement that does not work. It just simply doesn't work the way it's structured right now. Thanks for being with us. I know it's a lot to take in, but again, the Hunter Biden plea deal did not happen, falling apart, at least for now. The judge saying go back, work on this, and we'll meet again in a couple of weeks. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live, abcnews.com. I'll be back with the entire team for World News Tonight a little later today. I'm David Muir in New York. Until then, have a good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.